So Dan, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I am incredibly excited to talk to you about remote work, hybrid work, where we're going, and maybe a little bit of artificial intelligence. For those that don't know, could you give yourself like a 30-second sizzle reel of who you are and where you come from?
Absolutely. So I reside in Boston, Massachusetts. I have been focused on the world of work for definitely over a decade now. It's been 67 research studies, 3 books, 17 languages, over 200 conferences, thousands of articles, thousands of interviews. My company's Workplace Intelligence, and we are thought leadership and research boutique agency focused on the world of work. So this is something I'm passionate about and I look at 7 days a week.
Amazing. So you are definitely the person to answer the following questions that I have. So in researching you, again, you've had such a massive breadth of work. I don't think there's anyone that's really in a better position to be able to answer this question. Where do you think remote work is currently going? Because in the last 3 to 6 months, and for everyone that is an avid listener of our podcast, you would know that we're very, very passionate about remote work, and we've been doing it for almost 20 years, me, myself, and then also our conference running remote. And I've seen for the first time in the last 3 months some significant backlash towards remote work, a real resistance, almost, and I would say, and again, I don't want to necessarily bias you too much, a very aggressive resistance bordering on conspiratorial resistance to the pushback to the office. So where do you currently see the trends happening right now broadly with regards to remote work?
I like to start off really high level. It's not like when we're born, we don't want freedom and flexibility. It's not like when we're teenagers or we go to college or, when we, move out and get our own homes or apartments, we don't want freedom and flexibility. We always want freedom and flexibility. So at a high level, this is something that everyone wants, even those leaders that might be either encouraging or forcing people back into the office. So this is kind of a unanimous thing that people want freedom and flexibility. And the reason why I like the words freedom and flexibility is because a lot of the times when we talk about remote work, or basically all the times, it revolves around knowledge workers specifically, right? Because if you work in a factory, if you work, as an essential worker, you're in a hospital, you're in a supermarket, a pharmacy, like you can't really work remote. But with this idea of freedom and flexibility, we've done a ton of research to show that yes, everyone in every position can get some level of that, whether it's job sharing, whether it's flexible hours, job shifts, or remote work. So I think that's really important to set the tone. This is unanimously, everyone wants it. People want it in different degrees. There are certain personality types and people who work in a certain way that prefer certain different work environments, but not the same work environment every single day for the most part, right? So kind of my lens on this early on is, I did a work flexibility study, I think it was 8 years ago or so, and that's when not every company, especially the big companies, were allowing it. My first corporate job at a Fortune 200 tech company, I had created the first social media position there. And I wanted to work remote, and they said, no, you'll make everyone else jealous, right? So there is a social component, there's a political component, there's a control component, and of course there's like companies who have already invested in this office space so that they're incentivized to bring people back. There's the tax component. There's consumerism within cities, right? If you work remote in a suburb, potentially, less people are going to maybe go to those restaurants and use some of those services within a city, so that could hurt a city potentially financially. So basically where I end up with everything is in between in the hybrid working situation and environment. That's over 50% of companies have embraced hybrid. Even today, with what you were saying before, there's a bit of backlash against remote work. They're still going hybrid because it's the best of both worlds. You get freedom and independence. You get to meet with teammates in different ways. What was really interesting to me is Dropbox really early on, and I know I could go in a million different areas, but Dropbox early on basically said, fully remote all the time. We're not going to go back from giving people full freedom and flexibility to work wherever they want. But then their kind of productivity engagement dropped off a bit. So what they did is they did, one or two times a year, people met in person, and that made all the difference. So I think what that example shows me, and my book, Back to Human, how great leaders create connection in the age of isolation, the research I did for that, everything kind of sums up like this. Like, even if you're fully remote, you need to maybe meet in person at least once a year, because in-person interactions still matter. We're not getting rid of that, but we're also treating people like adults, and we need to focus more on kind of the output of the work instead of where and when people are working. And I think that's really important, because otherwise, especially over the past 3 years, a fourth of people who would never work remote in their whole lives work remote for the first time in Q1 of 2020, and a good percentage of them liked it. So what really happened, besides kind of from a research standpoint, what we found is we did a whole study with WeWork where we interviewed the C-suite and employees, and we found is people want to spend a third of their time, in an office, in a third space, whether it's a co-working space or a coffee shop, and then a third of their time at home. Again, kind of the whole study was around hybrid. And then, there's subsequent so many research studies that show that. So I think that where we're going to end up is sort of where we are today. And I do think, and I know you're going to ask this about what's the impact of remote work when it comes to how well we're doing economically. And I do think that how we're doing economically and employer versus employee kind of leverage and power are directly impacted by that. And so what you're seeing right now is that the power shifted a little bit, not too much, from the employee to the employer. We had such a boom economic period that it was very hard for managers to say, hey, you got to come back to the office 5 days a week, especially, towards the more beginning of that, when we were in COVID conditions, with the health-wise, and they didn't want it to spread. So there's all these things kind of impacting it. But Pandora's box is open and can't be shut. And there's now so many workers of so many different generations who have benefited from remote work or freedom and flexibility in ways of spending more time with their family, or many people, like for me, I work way better in the morning than I do in the afternoon at night, right? And so everyone's slightly different. And so from a high level, there's no one size fits all. It's not like your best practices. Let's say you have a fully remote work policy, one company does. It doesn't mean, hey, let's just completely copy that, because there's so many variables. What do the people in your organizations do? What country do they reside in and work in? What are their preferences? We call this employee voice. The CEO and leadership team, what are their kind of preferences and how they can manage? Are people trained? Are there policies in place? So many organizations had no remote work policy in place. So the ones that did, and the companies that established trust before COVID and had these policies, were way more successful during COVID over the past 3 years. Whereas a lot of these other companies had scrambled because they never thought of this, or they never thought they would have to do it. And so I don't think there's anywhere, we're not going back to 2019 conditions. And eventually, the kind of power will shift, like a pendulum, but we're still going to end up around in the middle, mostly with hybrid. Of course, there will always be fully remote companies. I interviewed a ton of CEOs from fully remote companies, and a lot of them were kind of newer companies rather than some of these larger, let's say, financial institutions where, to get them to go from full-time in the office to full-time remote is a huge seismic shift. But I even think that they will have to bend a little bit more to hybrid, especially once the economy bounces back.
Yeah.
I know that was a lot, but there's a lot of components to this.
Yeah, no,
and the
for
other
sure.
big thing, one of the more interesting takeaways that's really important. Now, I've worked remote for 11 years. I would never want to change it. So there is some kind of bias in that. But I do think that the people who like it will remain. And even though there's 10% fewer job postings, there'll be a lot more competition for those jobs. And other employers, especially the CEOs I've talked to, who said, hey, when more people were working remote, they had more competition. There was less competition before COVID, but now with more people working remote, there's more competition for that talent. And I think that if companies start to resort to full-time in the office, they're going to start to seize that talent again. So again, it's almost like, and then that will shift companies to then, especially with a better economy, to give more flexibility.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It's so funny. 2 weeks ago, we just had our company retreat. So we are a fully remote, asynchronous organization, which I actually want to talk to you about. I'm recognizing now, I'll throw that extra question in there. But when the entire team came together, a lot of those team members, we had not seen each other since 2019, and 42% of our headcount had actually not seen each other face to face. So we actually have collected a whole bunch of EMPS data and a bunch of other survey data pre and post to be able to analyze the direct effect of those company retreats. Because when I was researching company retreats, the first instance of a remote first company doing a company retreat was Joel Gascoigne, who runs a company called Buffer, which is a social media company, and they are a long-term remote first organization, speaker at Running Remote. And I have not found any quantifiable data with academic rigor to be able to suggest that a company retreat actually is a positive return on investment in terms of something that we're doing. And that's coming from someone that just spent $1.2 million on his company retreat 2 weeks ago, right? So it's a really interesting phenomenon to hear from you that you're seeing that same data coming back, saying people have actually got to come in and communicate in person at least once or twice a year.
Yeah. So, and the other thing I was going to mention is we looked at, the impact of remote work early on in COVID. And what we found was with people working remote, one of the side effects, again, there's so many benefits, freedom, flexibility, like we just talked about, a little bit more independence, maybe get to spend more time with friends and family, is people exchange their time spent commuting with more time spent working. So I hate commuting. But I think it's more about, people working more hours, 5 upwards of 10 more hours. There are fewer kind of work-life boundaries. Obviously, you go to a physical office and you leave that physical office, even though you're using your phone and you could still kind of respond to business email on nights on vacations, it's still, there's some divide there that has kind of always existed, and also is a psychological divide. And so that led to part of the burnout epidemic that people are facing as well. So I think that is a kind of downside to remote work, is more remote work means more hours, which increase productivity, which was kind of a plus for companies because they got higher output. But there is this side effect of mental health, and then more and more companies had invested in kind of well-being benefits to help those type of workers as well.
Right. I have another question to follow up on that. Brian Elliott, who is the senior research fellow at the executive leader of Future Forum, basically, Future Forum Group, which is a think tank that was run by Slack, then purchased by Salesforce, just let go literally last week, which is really unfortunate for that organization. His perspective is that hybrid is a waiting room between making a decision of going back to the office permanently or remaining remote. And he actually thinks that there is no hybrid definition. It is, you are either office focused or you're remote focused. What's your perspective on that?
I disagree, because I think you can be both. And I think especially in today's world with the leaders that we have and all this, there's also like the government plays a role in this, and taxes and spending a certain amount of time and time zones. There's all these variables that don't really get talked about when we talk about remote work. I do think that I'm not anti-office, and I do think that there are different business functions, different individuals, different leaders that might perform better working part-time in an office. I think I'm more against the case of companies mandating 5 days or even really 4 days in the office, because it just doesn't even make sense. And there's no kind of evidence. There's no study that exists that says remote work equals less productivity. It's actually the opposite. Right. And so I always kind of push people in that direction. But then also it can be too much productivity, and then that hurts people's mental health. So it's like, how do we find kind of a intermediate? And I feel like when I talk to, heads of HR or CEOs, the hybrid just clicks for them. And it just, from the employer side and the employee side, it's kind of a midpoint. And to get every company to do fully remote, it might not even be good for our economy, to be honest with you, because that means cities would be in a lot of trouble. So, and what you actually saw a little bit over the past few years is that a lot more, suburbs became mini cities because the retail followed where people are. So it could spread. So it's just kind of where we are right now. A lot of things could change, but in terms of messaging, in terms of getting people on board, in terms of at least pulling employers from 5 and 4 to 3 and 2, hybrid seems to work really well for that pitch.
Right. Yeah. No, I have a big perspective, which is that cities will cease to be a place to work and they'll start to be places to live. So focusing on creating a happy living relationship. I'm in Montreal, Canada right now. I'm looking out my window and I have a beautiful backyard, which has a bit of snow on it right now, but I can walk 5 minutes and I'm at 10 different coffee shops. I can go to a co-working space if I want. I actually do have an office here as well that I can go to. And it just provides me the autonomy to be able to work the way that I want to. It's very interesting. A follow on to that question. We talked about going back to the office and kind of the trends that are happening right now. The media would make it out to be that everyone's fundamentally heading back to the office. At least that's the perception that I'm getting in the press. Is that true or is that not true? And if so, why or why not?
Well, it's easy to say people are heading back to the office, right? I mean, you could see the traffic driving into cities and whatnot, but not full time. So what's really interesting, actually, and I picked up this last Friday, is on Friday, typically crazy rush hour, right? Especially in Boston. There was really no traffic at all. So what that signals to me is the day that more companies are letting employees work remote, at least Friday. I haven't really, looked at Mondays, but Friday really stood out to me. Of like Friday, especially around 3, 4 o'clock, the traffic should normally be like really, really bad, but it wasn't at all. So I do think that we already are kind of seeing that impact traffic. I mean, remember when so many, knowledge workers were working remote during COVID, like it was easy to get into the city, out of the city, to find parking. And so I do think remote work is good for limiting, fossil fuels, making it easier to get in and out of cities. So there's those benefits, but then there's, the kind of the downsides, less people in the cities working, which means those businesses take a hit. So it's kind of, that's again why I like hybrid, because it fulfills everyone's needs. It like checks the box for not just companies and employees, but, different other like businesses that get affected by this. So I only kind of took a step back when I was analyzing this because I was seeing different reports about, billions lost in New York with remote work and all this. And again, I do think that there is conflicts of interest of these big companies that want to pull employees back, and they advertise in the media. So there is probably some conflicts and kind of marching orders to get people back. But again, I do think, if I'm an all-star employee and I want to work remote, and I benefited from working remote over the past 3 years, to get me into the office 5 days a week, I'll do it. But while I look for another job, and I'm not the only one who's saying that, right? And that's why the competition for those fully remote jobs, or those at least partially remote jobs, is getting stiffer, right? So, but I do think that a lot of employers, obviously such as yourself, have seen this as an opportunity to take talent with more people to go back to work at least part-time.
Yeah, no, it's this quiet quitting phenomenon that we were seeing, which, I mean, obviously, I feel like we've hit the brakes on that one, at least for the
I think
current economic climate.
I actually think quiet quitting, the way I think about it, is people are kind of fed up with not getting the right benefits, such as remote work. But I think the biggest thing above and beyond remote work is money now, because of inflation. So if I were to say, what's the biggest pain point? What's the top reason that's like frustrating people, not just workers in general? I would say compensation has been like the largest topic this year because of inflation, the cost of living and cost of housing. I think money has kind of hit at the forefront, even ahead of remote work.
Interesting.
This year.
Yeah, you feel that it's definitely just, that's the top of mind for everyone, is those inflationary forces from an employee
Yeah, we're doing
perspective.
a lot of work on financial wellness and these type of topics, because this is definitely something that's in the top of mind of everyone, because, the difference between money and flexibility. I mean, you could make the case, if I work remote, I save money on commuting costs and, having to go out for lunch during the workday and all those type of things.
Sure.
But I think money psychologically is fully in the forefront because of the cost of, buying groceries, the cost of going out, like all, the cost, the housing, crisis we're in, the cost of education, like all this stuff has kind of boiled up, has really upset people. And so the kind of, the demand for money, or to ask for more money, or to work for a company that gives more money, even at the kind of cost of not getting as much flexibility, seems to be there for this year. Again, this could all change. The economy could return. And then I think the shift will be way more to people wanting that same remote work lifestyle that they had.
Yeah, I think we're going to see a lot more pain in the next couple quarters, unfortunately, on that one. But that's just my perspective on it.
I think the frustration stems from like companies making record profits, but 150,000 plus tech workers were laid off. So I think that all plays into the overall sentiment. And here's what's really interesting. So you'll love this. It's actually my favorite question. And we asked it twice in 2 different surveys with the same company. It was both a global audience. Before COVID, we said, like the whole 4-day work week, obviously know what that is and have read about it and whatnot. So we did a study. We kind of stumbled on the 4-day work week before Perpetual Guardian in New Zealand did the first successful test, I think, ever, right? This was in 2018. So we asked one question, if pay was consistent, how many days a week would you work? And back then in 2018, it was 4. We just did one. We did the same question with around the same audience in the same countries, and December of last year it came out, and it's like the most popular day was 1. So what we're really talking about here, what this tells me, and what all of this, everything I'm saying is, there's a negative sentiment around work and fairness right now, and that's like supersedes everything. And remote work's part of the equation, but I would argue that money or compensation is even higher than that. And I actually just did, I'm doing a post about how over 50% of employees have at least one side gig to make additional income to be able to afford what's happening with inflation, the housing market, et cetera.
Wow, 50%.
Because rents have shot up too.
Right. Wow. I mean, just even thinking about that in terms of the focus for your team members, if 50% of your team members are hustling another gig on the side, it's definitely going to impact overall output. It was actually a huge thing with tech workers who would have a second full-time job. Right. Yes,
so there's security issues around that too, and legal issues.
And actually, that was the question I wanted to push back on with regards to remote work. Not necessarily push back on, but address again. How many of the pushback towards remote work has nothing to actually do about the things that we see on the surface of remote work? Because I have to tell you, employer of record companies, right? Making sure that you're actually a California resident and you are still in California when you're working for Meta, as an example, or making sure that your company is PCI compliant. But if you're working remotely, how do you actually make sure that you have bank level security to be able to continue to do the work that you need to do? I remember the first month of COVID, I was speaking to my banker and I said, hey, I need to move some money about because I'm terrified. And she said, oh, well, I have to go into the office 1 day a week, but I have to choose my particular day to be able to run all these transactions, right? Because of PCI compliance. So it was completely impossible for her to be able to work completely remote. How much of that are you seeing that impacts these? Because I've had private conversations with very large companies that are really excited about switching to remote work, but their legal department says there is no way we can actually transition to a completely remote model.
That's absolutely one of the variables. There's a ton of variables. I would also argue that command and control still exists, especially because a good percentage of the CEOs of the big companies are baby boomers, and that's kind of their well-known leadership style. So I think that plays a big role into it, right? If I can't see you, you're not doing work, like the oversight. Right. The other thing I don't know if you study this, but it's something that I noticed during, at the period, like I was explaining in 2020, when fourth of people work remote that never did, and people, over 50% of people are working in hybrid work conditions and environments now, is the advancement and investment of workplace surveillance. So as I was like looking at the graph, like more and more people working remote, more and more investment and proliferation of employee surveillance and monitoring. And now it's like 80-90% of companies are doing it, which means probably closer to like 100%, right? So I think that just shows you one word, right? When we talk about remote work, it comes down to trust. So I think there's a lack of trust. And
on
so
both sides.
On both sides, yes.
Right.
So what's crazy is even though remote work means higher productivity, it still doesn't matter because there's still a lack of trust.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, speaking to your point there, you have an employee that might be running a side gig that makes your HIPAA or PCI compliant work environment completely redundant if you're working remotely. And that's a big security issue. So then therefore, I need to be able to have either you come back into the office or provide some type of monitoring layer simply to remain compliant. So it creates this really problematic push and pull between those two different sides. And so no one really knows how many apples are rotten in the bunch. And so basically, I think a lot of employers have assumed, well, they're all rotten. So therefore, we have to be able to provide this layer of accountability, electronic accountability, to be able to track that. So it's a very, very interesting phenomenon, and I've definitely been looking at that as well. Let me push back a little bit more. 3-year vision of remote work, right? We're 2023 right now. We've just entered 2023. I would say that 2023 is going to be the year of going back to the office. Right, we're going to see a lot more. We're going to see that click back to everyone going back to the office. What do you think 2024 and 2025 will hold?
Have no idea what's going to happen from an economic standpoint, but supposedly there'll be improvements in terms of interest rates. So you hear all these different things, right?
Sure.
I think again, at the end of the day, if I were to, if we would look to next year, if we look in 20 years. My bet is still hybrid. It's almost like being half pregnant, but I do think that things will settle in the middle, especially for this generation of leaders and workers. And I do think that things could change, though, with kind of new laws and kind of new policies that could enable more and more remote work. But I think it's safe to say that right now we're at about just over 50% are in hybrid with fully remote and fully office, kind of the skirts of that. I do think that the number of hybrid could go higher because I do think that if the economy does return next year or year after, you're going to see some of the companies that are forcing people to work full-time in the office budget at least a little bit to maintain their workers, right? Because, of course, like some of these larger financial institutions, for instance, their answer is, oh, we're just going to pay them so much they won't even care about remote work. But I think when enough, like one of the things that, I don't know if you read about this, it's one of my favorite articles of the past 4 months of the U.S. banks saying we want people in the office full time, and then the foreign banks saying we'll give freedom and flexibility. That to me, when that article was written in Bloomberg, that tells you what you need to know, right? Like those companies are going to push the U.S. banks or basically the companies that want full-time presence in the office to at least a little bit more in the, as like hybrid workers because of that. Because, oh, wow, we're going to lose talent to foreign banks. We got to do something about it. And so I do think, but they're not going to, I can't see these big financial institutions going from 5 to 0, but 5 to 3, I think it's possible.
Yeah. So to your point previously, one of the biggest frustrations that I had was when we flipped over to remote in 2020, and we were a remote first organization before that. I started to see big companies coming in and trying to steal our talent. So we lost out of our HR and recruitment team, of which we had 12 team members. 4 got grabbed by Meta. And I think it was literally just the recruiters said, well, we can now hire remote. So therefore, we're going to hammer you guys just like you were any kind of brick and mortar company. It was the first time that we really felt that, because we were having offers that were coming across our desk for double what it was in comparison to what we were paying. And we said, listen, we just can't pay that. You got to go work for Meta, right? It's the right decision for you. So it's really interesting to kind of see how that's going to happen. The real competition for work in 2024, 2025 might be, you can be location independent. You can work wherever you want. And a lot of workers right now, particularly young workers, are really excited about that concept, at least in the circles that I turn around in, particularly in the tech startup sector. Everyone wants that type of freedom to be able to work wherever they want, whenever they want.
The only thing with younger workers that I find is that, you know, especially if you went to college, you're just so used to walking down the hall and seeing 20 people who are around your age who have maybe similar goals or want to party or whatever they want to do. To go from that to working remote full time is a pretty big jump. And but that's why I think, it's very interesting. Like, you would assume that these C-level leaders wouldn't want to go to the office full time because they already have like their friend networks. They already have everything accounted for. Whereas someone who's a recent college graduate still is like looking for that type of community and this socialization to be able to find their friends, date, whatever. Because, like at least a third of people have dated their coworkers. Whether that's good or bad and there's pros and cons, it's just a fact, right? Because it's a pool of people that you're around regularly. So it's very interesting about like young people versus old people. Like old people, you would assume that if you're more experienced and been in the workforce longer, you'd want more remote work versus younger people who are still seeking that socialization. Yeah, no, it's definitely one of those things that I tell people that have recently switched over to remote work. You need to build social networks that are not connected to work. You need to actually go and talk to your neighbors. One of the first things that I tell people to do is, do you know your neighbors? And 90% of people say, no, I don't know them. I mean, I know that his name's Dan and he works next and he lives next door, but I have no idea if he's married or, if he likes to play PlayStation or Xbox. And if you create those types of connections, then you can be less dependent upon it. There's a lot of data to be able to show that the most unhappy period of someone's life is the 40 to 50-year-old tranche of life, and it's because they've lost all those social connections from university, and then after they retire, they're forced to actually interact in other social circles where it's not these kind of forced relationships or forced friendships that work unfortunately do provide you. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Yeah. I want to switch gears because I really want to talk to you about artificial intelligence. And this connects intimately to remote work, to be completely honest with you, because I actually think remote work, to a degree, has been a bit of a bridge towards artificial intelligence. Because if you are disconnected from your workers and they're ones and zeros on a screen, then artificial intelligence just seems like the next logical step. So Goldman Sachs just put out a really scary study that up to 80% of jobs in the United States could be affected by artificial intelligence. And they made a further suggestion that 25% of jobs could be replaced by artificial intelligence within that same amount of time. What do you think about that? Do you believe that? Do you think that that's is that an overestimation, an underestimation? What direction do you think you're going? Yeah, okay. I think if it's not 100% now, I think in the next few years, it's going to, every person, blue collar, white collar, regardless of industry and profession, will be interacting or using AI in some way because the employer will force it, or competitively, they'll have to use it or they'll be replaced, right? So I think that, we've done 4 studies called, AI at Work with Oracle. And that's kind of what we found, is that people are going to be interacting with people for their careers, for even their mental health. And so, AI, you can use it 24/7. it's mostly, I mean, you could argue that there is some bias, but eventually that will improve too. And we're only at the beginning, and ChatGPT, for instance, went from like 0 to 100 million in like overnight, pretty much, like a month or so. So it just shows you the scale and how much has changed. If you think about your use of it, kind of my use of it now, I'm like, where it's going to get to a point we're not even thinking about it, right? It's just kind of built into what we do and built into our habits. And I think that, like, for instance, if John is using ChatGPT as part of his job and Bill is not, and John's more productive, Bill could be let go. So I think about that a lot competitively. If this person is more productive and less, in terms of less, output over an hour or 8 hours, versus someone who isn't using it, who's spending more time and maybe wasting more time or getting less done in that same period, they're going to be gone. So I think people are going to be forced to use it, and I think that it's going to be so intertwined. I remember I was interviewing Neil deGrasse Tyson, and I was like, "Oh, what do you think about AI and replacing humans and all of this stuff?" And he says, "We're using AI and not even thinking about it already, and have been." So I think that that's how incredible technology is that it's already having such an effect, but we're not consciously thinking about it. And I think with ChatGPT, you're using it sort of right now, but eventually it's just it'll happen, like it's air, like it's just kind of going on in the background. So I do think it's going to be intertwined across the board, and it's definitely one of the most important areas. And when I think about like the biggest trends in the workplace, clearly like remote hybrid work, that is like transformational in itself, right? It's like a high level trend that's going to continue. I think AI and, at the higher level digital transformation is something that will always continue. Like in 40 years, I'll be doing digital transformation studies, right? So I think that's going to continue. And then I do think this need and emphasis on well-being at work is going to be big. And the other thing too, kind of going into what you were saying before about hiring skilled talent and their preferences for remote versus office or whatnot, is the labor and skills shortage. And that's another topic that I really focus on. We did a study with Amazon on upskilling and the desire to get new skills to be able to get ahead and frustrations around that. And I do think that despite these 150,000 plus tech layoffs and layoffs in other industries as well, there's still a huge demand for workers, especially with specialty skills and even service level jobs, right? Like go to your restaurant, whether it's you can walk to it, as you said, you can walk to a lot of things where you are, or drive to it in 5 minutes. Like no one has enough staff. Right, and that's just the service. And by the way, the service sector is pretty big. Like the tech sector, if you look at largest industries, the tech sector is not in the top 5 or 10 largest industries. Right. But when you're in tech, when you're doing this stuff, it just seems like, oh yeah, like the tech sector is our whole culture, and it really isn't. And a lot of people in the technology, a lot of tech workers, I believe it's 60% of tech workers aren't even working in tech.
What do you mean by that? Could you explain that?
As in they have tech skills, but are not working in the tech industry. They're technical professions. Yeah.
Got it. Okay, got it. So here's my bigger question for you. Let's say the Goldman Sachs is correct. Let's say worst case scenario, and I love the concept of, I'm sure you're acquainted with AGIs, artificial general intelligence, basically the ability to be able to have. So we have AI, which is ChatGPT, and then the direction that everyone's trying to go for is AGI, and artificial general intelligence, which generally is defined, and I love Sam Altman's definition of this, who's the CEO of OpenAI. It is a artificial intelligence that is the averagely intelligent person inside of your organization. However, you can create 5 billion of them in half a second, and you can have them do a ton of different jobs. There's a company right now that actually I interviewed that is working very aggressively on trying to create avatars of yourself. So literally having a Liam go into
Clone
another
Wars
meeting.
and Star Wars.
Absolutely. Having a digital Liam go in and interact with my email, or go in and maybe do this podcast, maybe Dan, you can have your AI and our two AI avatars can actually produce a piece of content together and then produce that and we can publish it somewhere. I mean, the possibilities are obviously endless, but once we get to that AGI point, that's when all of this stuff stops, right? Because if you have the averagely intelligent worker inside of your organization, it almost feels like an end of history thesis, to be completely honest with you. And it's very difficult for me to get my head around where we would be post that moment. Do you have any perspectives on how we would transition through that? Because the most conservative estimate from smart people in that space have said 10 years. And the most liberal estimate, the most aggressive estimate, is 3 years. So within 3 to 10 years, we will have an AGI that exists that is the averagely, and I'm probably the averagely intelligent person, the averagely mean intelligent person inside of my organization. So I would be able to create 1 million Liams that could do a whole bunch of different jobs, and then why would I hire any flesh and blood Liams anymore?
Yeah. No, I mean, when you say that to me, I immediately think of, okay, what's the competitive advantage here? Well,
right.
If people trust you or know of your brand and it's somewhat prominent, that is going to be a huge competitive advantage if the work is done by machines at the end of the day. So I think that the platform, brand, reputation will only become more important if everything else is kind of a common denominator.
So we're all going to become TikTok stars, basically. That's what you're saying.
I mean, I think this is very, I'm not sure about this, but I think part of the reason why they want TikTok on is not just because it takes away the eyes and time from other platforms, but I also think it's because, a lot of these people have been able to make an income on TikTok, and a lot of these companies want workers. Like I was saying, labor shortage. So if we get rid of TikTok, they're going to have to go back to work. And now that it sounds funny, but
yeah,
when you've worked in the corporate world for long enough, you can suspect certain things, especially when you read all these stories. But I think that everyone's like, everyone can be a social media influencer and be successful. I've been doing this since 2006. It's very hard. It takes a long time, and only the top 5%. The top 5% makes 95% of the income.
Right.
Something like that. It's at least the Pareto principle of 80-20, but yeah, it's much harder than it looks. Everything is much harder than it looks. But I do think AI is very promising. But AI, and I do agree with a lot of economists, and Andrew Yang says a lot of this stuff about how we need universal basic income. You need some sort of safety net. If you need a safety net, but you also need training, right? What are these new jobs that are going to be created, which hasn't been talked about enough, right? We've gone through all these transformations and new jobs were created. What are these jobs? So we need economists to be here are the jobs, right? Because we know which jobs have the highest likelihood of being automated and replaced. But what are the new jobs? Let's start to think about that. And then where's the training? And I do think we were supposed to have a jobs program in the US, but it actually never came to fruition. And I do think we need some sort of larger talent development sponsored by the government. Right now, I think that companies are the new post-secondary colleges because colleges can't move fast enough to train people for these new jobs. And but a lot of the onus is on companies right now. That's why you're actually seeing a lot of teachers quit their jobs and then work to do curriculum development at companies. That was a trend, I believe, a year ago. So I think but I do think it needs to kick up from a government perspective. It's like any of these companies that are trying the 4-day work week, the government has to kind of be a support system resource and kind of enact more kind of worker protection laws. Like France is a great example. They have the right to disconnect. You can't message or expect a response from an employee after quote unquote office or work hours. So I think that the protection aspect needs to go in there. And that's why it's more than just a company or industry issue. It's more of a
government issue too.
City, state, country, federal issue.
Yeah, very interesting stuff.
That needs to be acted on right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I believe Elon Musk and 1,000 other academics actually just had signed a document together stating, let's put a pause on AI for the next 6 months because we're building a monster that we might not be able to undo which is very scary in itself. I think that came out about 2 days ago. Well, Dan, it's been great chatting with you. My mind's been racing. Obviously, we could be here for about 3 or 4 hours.
Yes.
For anyone that wants to be able to learn more about what you do, where should we send people?
You can go to workplaceintelligence.com or go to my LinkedIn and subscribe to the Workplace Intelligence LinkedIn newsletter, which is it's growing. It's 387,000 subscribers, and we post every Monday morning.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Dan. Appreciate it. And we'll see you in the next one.
Thank you so much.